What if the greatest crowns in history were not built on strength, but on sickness? What if the palaces of Europe, glittering with gold and power, hid a truth so dark it destroyed entire dynasties? For centuries, kings and queens believed their blood was sacred, too sacred to be mixed with outsiders. To keep it pure, they married their cousins, their nieces, sometimes even their own brothers and sisters. They believed they were protecting their thrones. Instead, they were sowing the seeds of their own destruction. The most tragic proof of this obsession was a boy named Charles II of Spain. He was born the most powerful child in Europe. He inherited a vast empire that stretched across continents. But Charles was not healthy. His jaw jutted forward so severely he could barely chew. His body was frail. His mind was slow. He lived in pain and weakness and humiliation, the broken end of a once great dynasty. His story was no accident. He was the inevitable result of generations of inbreeding, a family tree that folded in on itself until it collapsed. And Charles was only one example. From the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of Europe, royal inbreeding shaped history in ways both devastating and unforgettable. So why did they do it? Why did rulers knowingly marry their own blood, condemning their heirs to madness, deformity, and death? And how did this obsession with purity become one of the darkest legacies of monarchy? To understand why kings and queens turned to their own blood as marriage partners, we must step into their world. A world where power was fragile, and every throne could be stolen with a single marriage contract. In the Middle Ages, and long before, marriage was not about love. It was about alliances. Every union was a weapon. A king's daughter was not his child. She was a bargaining chip, a bridge to another kingdom. And sometimes rulers decided that the safest alliance was no alliance at all. Why give a princess to a foreign king when she could marry her cousin and keep the family's fortune intact? Why risk an outsider claiming the throne when a nephew could be tied to a niece and the crown would never leave the dynasty? There was also something deeper, a belief in blood itself. Many monarchies saw their lineage as divine. Pharaohs of Egypt claimed to descend from gods, Chinese emperors from heaven itself, European kings from heroes of legend. To mix that sacred blood with commoners was unthinkable. Purity became an obsession, and with it came fear. Fear of outsiders, fear of losing control, fear of betrayal. By marrying within, they imagined themselves safe, strong, eternal. But what they didn't know was that this strategy came with a hidden curse. Each cousin's marriage tightened the circle. Each sibling's union narrowed the bloodline further. And behind the gold crowns and velvet robes, a slow decay began to spread. The very thing they thought would make them invincible would, in time, make them weak. This is where the story of royal inbreeding begins. Not in romance, but in fear, pride, and the desperate hunger to keep power locked within the family. But to see how far this obsession goes, we have to leave the palaces of Europe and step back thousands of years. Because the idea that royal blood must remain pure was not born in Spain or France or England. It was born under the burning sun of Egypt, where pharaohs claimed to be living gods. And gods, after all, could not marry mortals. Long before the castles of Europe, long before the Habsburgs and Tudors, the idea of keeping royal blood pure was born in the deserts of Egypt. To the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was not just a king. He was a god, the son of Ra, the living Horus, the divine ruler who bridged heaven and earth. And if a god married a commoner, what would that make their children? Less than divine. The solution was chilling. The pharaohs often married their own sisters, sometimes their own daughters. By keeping the bloodline closed, they believed they were keeping their divinity intact. The most famous of them all, Cleopatra VII, was the product of centuries of sibling marriages within the Ptolemaic dynasty. To outsiders, this looked like decadence. To the Egyptians, it was a sacred duty. Across the ocean, the Incas of South America practiced something eerily similar. Their emperor, the Sapa Inca, was called the Child of the Sun. And like Egypt's pharaohs, he was expected to marry his sister, the Koya, to keep the royal line untainted. This wasn't a whispered scandal. It was official policy, written into the very fabric of their empire. Even in ancient Mesopotamia, among the early Sumerian and Babylonian kings, records show marriages between close kin. The reasoning was the same: land, power, divinity. Keep it all within the family. But behind the ritual, the cracks were already forming. Ancient physicians noted strange weaknesses among heirs. Dynasties that seemed untouchable would suddenly collapse. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he found a royal family divided and weakened by generations of marrying too close. When the Spanish reached the Andes, the Inca nobility fell apart under the weight of internal strife and fragile leadership. In these civilizations, sibling marriage was not scandal. It was sacred. Yet history would prove that even gods were not immune to the silent curse hidden in their bloodlines. And as centuries passed, this same obsession, the illusion of purity, would echo into the marble halls of Europe, where kings and queens would unknowingly repeat the same mistakes of the pharaohs. By the Middle Ages, Europe had embraced a strange paradox. Christian monarchs preached morality, condemned sin, and warned of corruption. Yet within their palaces, they practiced something the church itself had once forbidden: marrying their own kin. The reasoning was clear. Europe was a battlefield of shifting borders and fragile alliances. A marriage could mean peace or war, and the closer the marriage kept the crown to itself, the safer a dynasty seemed. Take the Capetian kings of France. For centuries they strengthened their grip not through conquest alone, but through cousin marriages that tied noble houses tightly together. The closer the bonds, the harder it became for outsiders to claim the throne. In England, the Plantagenets followed a similar path. Cousin married cousin, weaving a web of alliances so tight that when the Wars of the Roses erupted in the 15th century, nearly every claimant was related by blood. The result was chaos. Thrones contested not by strangers but by cousins who shared the same ancestors. But it was during the Renaissance that the obsession reached its height. The great dynasties of Europe, the Habsburgs, the Valois, the Tudors, all turned inward. In their eyes, a foreign spouse meant foreign influence. A cousin, a niece, or a distant relative, that meant loyalty. That meant safety. The Catholic Church, once a barrier to close marriages, bent under the weight of politics. Popes granted dispensations freely, allowing unions that were technically forbidden. A marriage between first cousins could be justified. Sometimes even uncle and niece could be excused if the prize was great enough, and so the pattern deepened. Generation after generation, the same blood was recycled, the same genes reshuffled in a closed loop. Kings and queens wore crowns of gold, but beneath them their heirs grew weaker, frailer, more prone to sickness and sudden death. Whispers began to spread. Some lines seemed cursed. The Valois of France produced brilliant rulers, but also fragile children who rarely survived. The Tudors, desperate for an heir, clung to their bloodline with tragic results. From Henry VIII's sickly son Edward to the heartbreaking stillbirths that haunted his wives, Europe had become a stage where crowns glittered, marriages dazzled, and dynasties rose. But behind the velvet curtains, a hidden decay was eating away at the foundations of royal power, and nowhere would that decay become more visible than in the family that would take inbreeding further than anyone else: the Habsburgs. If inbreeding was a slow poison, no dynasty swallowed more of it than the Habsburgs. For centuries they ruled like giants. Their empire stretched across Europe and into the New World. Their motto was simple: let others wage war, you fortunate Austria marry. And marry they did, but always to their own. The Habsburgs perfected the art of strategic incest. Cousins wed cousins, uncles wed nieces. Each marriage kept their vast lands united, but each one tightened the noose on their bloodline. By the 17th century, the damage was undeniable. The Habsburgs of Spain became a living experiment in genetic collapse. Out of 16 great-great-grandparents that an ordinary person might have, King Charles II of Spain had only 6. His family tree was not a tree at all, but a twisted circle. Charles's appearance was striking and tragic. His infamous Habsburg jaw jutted so far forward that he struggled to chew his food. His tongue was so enlarged he could barely speak. He suffered seizures, mysterious illnesses, and mental delays. Rumors whispered that he was bewitched, cursed by enemies. But the truth was darker. He was cursed by his own bloodline. Despite being married twice, Charles never fathered a child. Doctors examined him and concluded he was impotent. Some even claimed his body had aged like that of an old man while he was still young. He became known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. When Charles II died in 1700 at just 38 years old, The Spanish Habsburg line died with him. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, plunging Europe into chaos. The greatest dynasty in Europe, brought low not by war or rebellion but by the silent hand of inbreeding. The Habsburg curse became a legend. And Charles II, the boy king who could barely rule, barely live, became its most haunting symbol. The Habsburgs may have carried the most infamous curse, but they were far from alone. Across the world, dynasties large and small wove themselves into knots of blood. In France, the House of Bourbon, heirs to the throne after the Valois, also leaned heavily on cousin marriages. Their obsession with consolidating power led to generations of frail heirs. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, watched nearly all of his children die young. Some historians trace this wave of tragedy not just to disease, but to the Bourbon tendency to marry within their circle. His grandson, Louis XIII, inherited a line riddled with poor health, though it would take centuries more for the Bourbons to completely unravel. Far earlier, in Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty embraced sibling marriage with near religious zeal. Founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. To the outside world, their court was dazzling. Gold, temples, and marble halls along the Nile. But beneath the surface, brother married sister, generation after generation. By the time Cleopatra VII took the throne, her family line was riddled with the quiet cost of incestuous unions, sudden deaths, madness, and fragile rulers hidden behind grand titles. The story was the same in smaller courts across Europe. The Portuguese Braganzas, the Neapolitan Bourbons, even the Russian Romanovs, all practiced marriages within close bloodlines, though not always as extreme as the Habsburgs. The closer the crown, the closer the spouse, and beyond Europe echoes continued. In the Hawaiian Islands, the sacred rulers known as ali'i nui sometimes married siblings to preserve their mana, their divine spiritual power. Among the Incas, as we've seen, the emperor and his sister were joined to preserve the son's bloodline. It was never framed as corruption. To their eyes it was duty. To their priests it was divine. To their people it was tradition. But step back and the pattern is unmistakable. The more closed a dynasty became, the more fragile it grew. From the Ptolemies to the Bourbons, from Egypt to France, power was preserved, but at a cost hidden in the blood itself. And in time, science would reveal why these great families were haunted by weakness and disease. The truth was not mystical. It was genetic. For centuries, the tragedies of royal families were wrapped in superstition. People whispered of curses, sorcery, or the wrath of God. But today, science gives us a clearer, and far darker, explanation. Every human carries hidden flaws in their DNA, recessive genes. Most of the time, these flaws remain invisible, because they are balanced out when we marry outside our families. But when relatives marry, the chance of those hidden flaws meeting doubles, triples, multiplies. And when the same bloodline is repeated generation after generation, the risks compound into something catastrophic. The Habsburgs are a perfect case study. Geneticists have reconstructed their family tree and found that Charles II's level of inbreeding was equivalent to being the child of a brother and sister. His body was a battlefield of recessive traits. The infamous Habsburg jaw, infertility, weak immunity, neurological problems. His family's obsession with blood purity left him barely able to function as a king, and the Habsburgs were not alone. The epileptic fits of some Bourbon princes, the madness of Britain's George III, the hemophilia that crippled the Romanovs, all trace back in part to the dangers of narrow bloodlines. In the case of hemophilia, the mutation passed down by Queen Victoria turned her descendants into fragile figures, bleeding uncontrollably from even the smallest wounds. To a medieval mind, these were curses. To a Renaissance court, signs of divine punishment. But modern genetics tells us the truth. These were not curses from the heavens, but consequences of human choice. What rulers thought would protect their dynasties, marrying their kin, keeping bloodlines pure, was actually eroding them from within. Palaces glittered on the outside, but inside their nurseries lay sickly heirs, fragile princes, and childless kings. The real curse of inbreeding was never mystical. It was written in the code of life itself. Genes did not care about crowns or kingdoms or divine right. They simply punished those who ignored their laws. And while history often speaks of dynasties and empires as if they were abstract forces, the reality was far more human, because behind every collapsed bloodline, there were children, sons and daughters, born into palaces of gold yet condemned from their first breath. Some became symbols of weakness, others pawns in political games, but all of them were trapped. And it is in their stories that the true tragedy of royal inbreeding comes to life. Consider Charles II of Spain again. To his courtiers he was the king, surrounded by jewels and tapestries. But to those who saw him up close, he was a boy trapped in a broken body. He could not chew his food. He could not father children. His mind was often clouded, his speech slurred. His servants whispered that he looked more like a sickly old man than a monarch in his prime. He was worshipped in ceremony and pitied in private. Then there is the story of Juana of Castile, known cruelly to history as Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. Daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, she was married into the Habsburg line. As years passed, Juana became increasingly unstable, overcome by fits of jealousy and paranoia. Was it mental illness? Was it grief? Or was it, as modern scholars suspect, another consequence of the family's narrowing bloodline? Her tragedy was not only her own. Her instability shaped the fate of Spain for generations. And think of the Romanovs. Alexei Nikolaevich, the heir to the Russian throne, was born with hemophilia, the genetic disease carried by Queen Victoria's descendants. A simple cut could leave him bleeding for hours. His entire childhood was shadowed by fear. His parents lived in constant dread that one fall, one bruise could kill him. It was this desperation that opened the door for Rasputin, the mystic who claimed he could heal the boy, and whose influence helped push Russia closer to revolution. Even the glittering Tudors were not spared. Henry VIII's desperate quest for a male heir was fueled by repeated miscarriages and sickly infants. His only son, Edward VI, ascended the throne at 9, frail, coughing, and weak. He ruled for just 6 years before dying at 15. His short life was another silent reminder of how fragile royal heirs could be. Behind every crown there was a child. Behind every dynasty there was a family. And while the world saw power and splendor, the reality was often heartbreak, lonely kings, fragile princes, and queens who buried child after child. The true cost of royal inbreeding was not just dynasties collapsing. It was the human suffering that came before the fall. Princes too weak to walk, queens unable to bear children, kings mocked in whispers by their own courts. But history is never kind enough to leave tragedy contained within palace walls. The choices of kings and queens echoed far beyond their bedrooms, altering wars, shifting borders, even changing the fate of nations. Because the story of royal inbreeding is not just a tale of sickly heirs and tragic kings. It shaped the very course of history. When Charles II of Spain died childless in 1700, it did not simply mark the end of a bloodline. It triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that drew in nearly every major power in Europe. The map of Europe was redrawn, not by conquest, but by the genetic collapse of one man's dynasty. The same pattern can be seen elsewhere. The fragile health of heirs often destabilized thrones. In France, the Bourbon children who died young left the monarchy weaker by the time of the Revolution. In England, Henry VIII's desperate struggle for a male heir fractured his kingdom and gave birth to the English Reformation, a split that reshaped religion and politics for centuries. And in Russia, the hemophilia of Tsarevich Alexei brought Rasputin into the royal court, undermining faith in the Romanovs at a time when revolution was already brewing. A single genetic disorder, passed through generations of intermarriage, became one thread in the unraveling of an empire. The legacy is not only political, it also shifted how society thought about royalty. Once seen as divinely chosen, untouchable, almost superhuman, kings and queens came to be viewed as tragically human, vulnerable to the same weaknesses as anyone else, and in some cases, far weaker. The mystique of royal blood cracked. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the lesson was clear. Monarchies across Europe began to widen their marriage pools. Royals married foreign princesses, nobles, and eventually even commoners. The age of cousin marriage dynasties was ending, replaced by the idea that survival depended not on purity, but on adaptation. Yet the scars remain in history. Palaces that gleamed with power fell silent. Thrones that once seemed eternal were toppled. And at the root of so many collapses was not rebellion, not conquest, but something hidden deep within the blood of kings and queens. The obsession with purity had promised immortality. Instead, it delivered extinction. This was the legacy of royal inbreeding, dynasties undone not by their enemies, but by themselves. And so the question remains, what truly destroyed these dynasties? Was it war, rebellion, betrayal? Or was it something quieter, something hidden in their very veins? History tells us the answer. Power undone by the very obsession meant to protect it. Today monarchies still exist, but the age of closed, inbred dynasties is gone. Modern royals marry outsiders, even commoners, not out of rebellion but survival. The lesson has been learned. Too late for Charles II, but not too late for history. When we look back at the portraits of pale princes, frail queens, and the haunted eyes of Charles II, we are reminded of this dark truth. Greatness built on fragile foundations will always fall. And perhaps, in their tragedy, we see a warning, not just for kings and queens, but for anyone who believes that power can last forever. After all, even the blood of monarchs can betray them. If you found this story haunting, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more dark tales from the hidden corners of royal history. Because sometimes the greatest stories of power are really stories of downfall.